Hello, everyone. This is just to supplement the videos, materials for this week while we're reading John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. I found some old notes, really some study questions, alternative set of study questions that I thought I would go over as a means of helping you through your reading of this book and what sort of things I'm thinking about in preparation, for the exam, of course, but just to sort of emphasize what I think we should be getting out of this book. So here, chapter one, first question here. Explain what Mill means by the criterion of right and wrong. Well, I hope that we have some idea of what a criterion is. Criterion. Criterion is a reference by which we judge something. So, say that we were judging that somebody was a good baseball player. If I say that Lenny Dykstra was a great player, not a very good person, but a great player when he played for the Phillies back in the '90s, and I made a claim, but I at least implicitly am referring to some sort of standard. That is, what is it that makes him? By what standard am I judging that was a good baseball player? Well, it's mostly because he could hit, and I would say that he never swung at a bad pitch. That's what I mean. So what I'm saying is my reference there and my criterion that I'm referring to in judging that he was a good player is that he never swung at a bad pitch. It was impossible to strike out. So that's my criterion, let's say. So the criterion of right and wrong is the standard that we refer to when we're judging if something is right or wrong. What is our principle, you might say? And clearly, the criterion of right and wrong for Mill is the principle of utility. Something is right if it promotes happiness. Something is wrong if it diminishes happiness or causes the reverse of happiness. That's the criterion. So, in any situation or any particular set of circumstances, somebody does something, somebody performs an act. If we're judging whether it's a right act or not, our reference, our standard is the principle of utility. Did the act promote human happiness, or at least did it not diminish human happiness or cause unhappiness? That's our criterion. So the criterion of right and wrong is the standard by which we judge the morality of actions, whether they're right or whether they're wrong. And Mill thinks that he has provided the correct, valid criterion in the principle of utility. Mill thinks that it is uniquely important for moral philosophy, as opposed to other studies like algebra and physics, to discover its own first principles. Why? Well, again, the first principle of Mill's ethics is that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness, wrong insofar as they promote the reverse of happiness. And he thinks it's important to bring that to light. But what he says about other sciences or studies, if we consider mathematics a form of science, is that it's not always so important to know and to be clear about first principles. He mentions algebra as having no one really knows what the first principles of algebra are. That is the starting points, the foundation of algebra. You don't need to know those things to do algebra, to solve algebraic problems. You don't really even need to necessarily know in all situations the first principles of physics to solve problems in physics. But that moral philosophy is different. Insofar as in moral philosophy, we are pursuing ends or goals. We are aiming at something. And what Mill says is that if we are to know what at which we should aim, what goals we should have, we need to know what is the good. And what is the good is the first principle. So in moral philosophy, it's different. than in other studies. That is, it's important to know what the first principles are. It's not always important to know what first principles are in other studies. Mill suggests that Kant, this is in chapter 1, with regard to the first categorical imperative, is actually employing utilitarian ideas. How so? Well, he mentions Kant, and you should see that in the chapter, that he has a lot of respect for Kant, but he thinks that Kant, for all his anti-consequentialist ideas, is actually a kind of utilitarian. And he's talking about the first categorical imperative. Remember, the first categorical imperative says that for an action to be ethical, you must be able to will that it be a universal law. That is, that everybody act the same way in that situation or in a similar situation. And if you can't will that, then you know that the action would not be ethical. Well, Mill says, well, what is that but a utilitarian standard? For instance, let's just say that Kant believes that you can't lie. Why not? Because if you say, well, if I want everybody, I would will that everybody act the same in my situation. That is, tell a lie when it's advantageous to them. Well, then all truth telling would disappear and no one would trust anybody. That's why you can't will it. But Mill points out, I think correctly, well, that's a utilitarian standard. What you're saying is that if everyone were to do what you're doing, then that would cause a lot of unhappiness. And it would be impractical in that sense. So he's got a kind of a point there that it does seem that at least with regard to the first categorical imperative, he is actually employing, tacitly, implicitly. Not, Kant would not say that, but Mill says that, well, he's really, whether he knows it or not, being a kind of a utilitarian. So chapter 2, what is the greatest happiness principle? It's something you should be able to just come up with in your own version. Actions are good insofar as they promote happiness, bad insofar as they promote the reverse of happiness, something like that. It can be put in many different ways. And explain how this can serve as a criterion of right and wrong. And all I'm asking you to do there is perhaps something that's a little bit too obvious to be clear. Use that principle as a way of evaluating a particular situation. How can this serve as a criterion of right and wrong? Well, we look at a situation and we look at what somebody did. Let's say in the scenario that I gave you in the Kant exam, where somebody basically misrepresents their income on a loan application. We would, if we're evaluating that act of misrepresenting your income on a loan application, we could refer to the principle of utility. Does that act, on the whole, promote the happiness of everyone involved or not? That is how we would judge that act. Now, there are different applications. That's a big theme, is that it's not always easy to apply general principles to particular situations. It's not always clear what the right answer is or what answer we come up with, but that's how it's done. Right? The idea that you apply the principle to a particular situation to get an answer, and that's what it means to use a criterion of right and wrong. How does the greatest happiness principle define happiness? Happiness is pleasure. That is why utilitarianism is a hedonism. Hedonism comes from the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. So any philosophy of life that says that pleasure or enjoyment is the greatest good, that is the point of life, to get as much pleasure and enjoyment out of it as possible, is a hedonism. Utilitarianism, according to Mill, as he says in the principle of utility, if the good or happiness is pleasure, then utilitarianism is a hedonism, because it says that happiness is pleasure. Now, of course, that leads to his long discussion of the different sorts of pleasures that a human being is capable of, higher and lower pleasures, but That's what it is. Defines happiness as pleasure. Yes, and so explain how utilitarianism is a kind of hedonism. Again, hedonism is the general theory that the point of life is pleasure or enjoyment, however you want to translate it, the Greek word hedone. So clearly, if utilitarianism says that happiness is the point of life and that things are good insofar as they promote happiness, and it defines happiness as pleasure, then of course it's a kind of hedonism. What does Mill say is the only thing desirable in itself? Happiness. Happiness is the only thing desirable in itself. Something that we always want for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. This goes back to actually Aristotle's ethics and his definition of happiness, as Mill is taking that straight from Aristotle and probably from a larger tradition of ethics and morality. It goes back to the Greeks. But the only thing desirable in itself is happiness and pleasure. Explain how utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. Well, any moral philosophy that judges the ethicality or the moral value of any action in terms of its results is a consequentialism, as opposed to a Kantian approach, which pretty much ignores consequences in favor of intentions. That is, we can see that, if we think about this structure, which I'm sure you've seen in other videos, where you sort of think about any human act as having this sort of structure. There's an intention or a reason or a thought or the will behind the act. Then there's the act itself. And then there are the consequences or results that flow from the act. It's clear that Kant is concentrating, saying this is where the action, or this is what's important, is the intention behind it. Whether it's done out of a good will, that will determine whether it's a good act. Whereas a utilitarian is saying, no, when we're trying to determine whether something is a good act, we look at this. So really incompatible. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Put this quote in context. What is Mill trying to prove here? Well, the context is that he's trying to prove that there are higher and lower pleasures, and that the principle of utility in defining happiness as pleasure is not degrading to human beings, because human beings are capable of a wide variety of pleasures, and many of those pleasures are the so-called higher pleasures, which animals like pigs are not capable of. And that no one would be satisfied with the life filled with the pleasures of a pig, no matter how many of them were fully satisfied. We'd rather have some amount of dissatisfaction and also have our higher pleasures, because we just think those higher pleasures are necessary for a real human life. So that's the context. And what he's trying to prove there is that, that essentially the higher pleasures are more valuable to us than the lower ones. What proof of that is? Well, what does Mill say is the proof that the higher pleasures are more pleasurable, intrinsically more enjoyable than the lower pleasures? Well, it's choice. And that's an important part of the chapter, where he says that the real proof of this is that if you take people who have experienced both, that is, people who have direct experience of in their lives, both the so-called lower pleasures and the so-called higher pleasures, and you ask them which ones they prefer, they will invariably, he says, choose the higher pleasures over the lower pleasures. So it's really a matter of preference. If you ask people who've experienced both, they will say, he says, as a matter of observation, they will tell you they prefer the higher pleasures. So it's It's really a matter of the proof is in what people who know both prefer and the claim that that they prefer the higher pleasures. Looking at chapter 3, things get a little more complicated, right? The title of this chapter is The Ultimate Sanction of the Principle of Utility. So what is Mill looking for here when he's looking for this sanction, and especially how is he using the word sanction? This is explained very well by Mill in the text, but that word sanction has different shades of meaning, and it's important to know which shade of meaning Mill has in mind here. The sanction of something is something which gives it its force. The sanction of something is something that gives it its authority. So the sanction of the principle of utility is, what is it that gives the principle of utility its authority over us? That would be its sanction. That is, what is it that gives it its force? And remember that it's kind of complicated, but the principle of utility is that we should always do that which increases the total amount of happiness, right? We should always choose that act which promotes the most happiness and avoids unhappiness to the greatest degree. So at this point, he's really concerned with a certain amount of what's the sanction for the order really to be unselfish, right? Not just to consider my own happiness, but to consider the greater happiness, the happiness of everyone involved. What is it that gives that authority over me? That's his real concern here, because if one major objection that he wants to meet about utilitarianism is that it's degrading, the other major objection is that it promotes selfishness, and he thinks that that's just not true. It's the greater happiness principle, right? What does Mill mean by the greater happiness morality, which is a phrase that he begins to use here? He means that utilitarianism is all about the happiness of the social whole, or at least the happiness of everyone who's involved, who's affected by the consequences of an action. And so the sanction of the principle of utility would be, what is it that gives force to the directive that I should be concerned with everybody's happiness, not just my own. So he says that there are external sanctions of the principle. What does Mill say are the external sanctions of the principle? And that's really social approval and the avoidance of disapproval. We don't want to, that in a practical way, you simply have to be concerned with the happiness and welfare, general welfare of other people, because if you're not, people will hate you, and you might go to jail, right? I mean, so there are external sanctions that push you to be concerned with the happiness of other people, and they're real. You can see it in the way that people drive. I mean, why do people stop or slow down when they see a pedestrian or something? I mean, part of it is that you just have to stop, because if you hit somebody, that's not only terrible, but it's going to be terrible for you, right? That would be an external sanction. But Mill certainly thinks there are internal sanctions, right, where we do things not just to avoid punishment or to avoid hassle or to avoid social disapproval. Those would be the external sanctions. Mill says there's an internal sanction. And, what is the ultimate internal sanction? For me to be concerned with other people. And he says it's a subjective feeling. I care about other people, I lived downtown, and there were a couple of snowy days last winter, and it got kind of icy. I live on a pretty busy block where if you let the snow lay too long, people trample it down. Pedestrians are going to trample it down. It becomes ice. And so you have to have a really good shovel, like a metal shovel. If you try to I'm sorry about this anecdote, but if you try to shovel that with a cheap plastic snow shovel, you're in for a lot of problems. So you get a good metal, like landscapers shovel. And so I was out there doing it a few months ago, and there was a very small person doing it with a couple doors down. And I felt so sorry for her. I just went over and did it for her with my better shovel, because, I mean, why did I do that? Well, hopefully because I'm a semi decent person, right? But thinking about it in Mill's sense, as I was recently, I did it because I felt pity for her. I felt bad for her, struggling with this crappy plastic shovel, basically trying to break up ice with it. And it's just, what, the internal sanction there is a subjective feeling of caring for another human being, or perhaps caring about the welfare of, and that sort of thing is, Mill says, is, maybe it's not completely natural to us, that feeling, but it's certainly something that comes naturally to us, and something, importantly for Mill, something that can be encouraged in people and should be encouraged in people and should be the basis of our legislation, our form of government, our economic system, should all be built upon that internal sanction of, yeah, we care about other people. We want other people to be happy, not just ourselves, not even just our close friends or family, but everybody. And we want to. So the internal sanction is a subjective feeling of caring, pity, love, affection, sympathy, however you want to put it. So, yeah, the cultivation of feelings is incredibly important for Mill, because it's the cultivation of that social feeling I'm talking about. Finally, chapter 4, this is where it gets, I think, pretty difficult. Explain why Mill thinks it is so difficult to prove the greatest happiness principle, because it's difficult or perhaps impossible to prove any first principle. That's part of the logic of it, right? I hope I covered this somewhat in the videos. That a first principle, like the first principle of any science, is first. It comes first, right? So the first principles are not things that we can really prove, because they're the things that we assume in order to prove other things. So it's difficult to prove the greatest happiness principle because it's a first principle. A principle is first. It is that which we assume to be true, so that we can prove other things. So, like in Euclid's geometry, one of the first principles is the whole is greater than the part, meaning in any figure, that the whole figure is greater than, larger than any of its parts. So that you have to assume in Euclid. You can't prove that, but the idea is that it's so obvious that it doesn't need proof. May not be as obvious in moral philosophy that something like the greatest happiness principle is self-evidently true. But if it's a first principle, you really can't prove it. What you can do is argue for it, which he certainly does. He thinks that the greatest happiness principle, even though he can't absolutely prove it, he can argue for it, and he can say that it's probably the one that's most amenable to human nature. It comes naturally to us. We think like this already, etc. Mill claims that happiness is the only thing we desire. Okay, that is just goes along with saying that happiness is the only thing that's inherently desirable, and we desire everything else for happiness' sake. How does he respond to the objection that we desire at least one other thing, virtue? Well, virtue here, I would say, is doing good, or doing good for others, making sacrifices for others, which his critics would object. Well, we don't just desire happiness; we desire virtue. Right? We desire doing the right thing. And Mill, I think, in chapter 4, is arguing that that his critics are right insofar as we do desire virtue. We want to be good people. We want to do the right thing. But we have to train ourselves that way. We have to be educated that way. And the trick is that we have to develop the right habits so that doing the right thing, the virtuous thing, actually makes us happy. This is why education is such an important thing for Mill. The cultivation of the feelings, the cultivation of the intellect. We have to train ourselves so that doing the right thing actually does give us pleasure, makes us happy. This is a very old idea that goes back to Aristotle. That we have to learn how to feel pleasure at doing the right thing. So I found these notes, these questions from previous times when I gave the course, and I thought that going through these sort of questions, giving you a informal notion of what sort of answers I would give them might actually help.